Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AGU's Diversity and Inclusion Plenary. I'm AGU's President-elect, Robin Bell, and I'm very pleased to welcome to this year's Diversity and Inclusion Plenary on sexual harassment of women, climate consequences in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. A panel discussion on the recommendations from the consensus report from the National Academy of Sciences. Today, we're gathering to discuss the findings of this report, address the research, policies, and strategies that can help prevent and address sexual harassment. This report is a proof that there's been a seismic shift in our community around the issues of sexual harassment and bullying. Not measured on the global seismic network, but it's been a shift in our community felt by many. These seismic waves were so large that they were even reached late night comedy shows. Definitely a measure of the magnitude of this issue. This seismic event is finally drawing the curtain on behavior that for decades we've been ignoring, behavior that we've just been wringing our hands for as the pipeline leaked. The fields of science, technology, and math have fostered an environment where women and underrepresented groups simply have felt out of place or often directly harassed. Something I experienced as a graduate student and continue to experience throughout my career. I know many scientists of all career stages who've left our field because of this toxic environment. The talent we've lost as a result of our failure to address these issues is hard to quantify, but our planet needs to address the threats it faces, and it needs these people at the table. It's appropriate to have this discussion at the start of our centennial, where we have a time to reflect on the past, but think about ways we can transform our science looking to the future. The success and the advancement of Earth and space science depends on a diverse pool of researchers. A diverse pool brings innovation, creativity, passion, and unique experience and perspectives to studying the challenges we're trying to address and we're facing. We simply need to do better. We do better science when we have a diverse face around the table. Diversity and inclusion are at the heart of many AGU programs and initiatives, but we still can do more. Last year, we updated our ethics policy and adopted a position statement on the rights and responsibilities of a scientist that includes a diverse and inclusion piece. Our ethics statement defines harassment as scientific misconduct. Yes, harassment is as bad for science as is plagiarism. Many other scientific societies and academic institutions have since followed AGU's lead. But in the early part of the new year, we'll launch the AGU's Equity and Ethics Center, centerpiece of the AGU Centennial. The center will provide real-world resources and promote and ensure responsible scientific conduct and establish tools and practices and data for organizations to foster a positive work climate in science. Today, our invited speakers will share strategies for addressing sexual harassment and bullying in our field, as well as encouraging cultural change at the department level, leveraging partnerships, and reaching other communities, and share how we think about diversity from an international perspective. Following their brief presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. I ask you hold your questions and any comments to the end. It's now my pleasure, and what I'm going to do is introduce all of them at once, and then we're going to have them come up, but brief, and they're each going to give a brief statement. Fraser Benya is the Senior Program Officer of the Committee of Women in Science and Engineering and Medicine at the National Academies of Science. Her work focuses on ensuring that science and engineering and medicine are ethical and socially responsible, both in their practice and who gets to practice that work. She's recently served as the study director for the National Academies Consensus Report, the report we're talking about today. Kate Clancy is an associate, and they're in line over there, so if you want to know what they look like, that's what they look like. So Kate Clancy is the associate professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois, with affiliations in the program for evolution, ecology, and conservation, and the Beckman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology. In her lab, they investigate the ways women's reproductive physiology varies and how that variation is informed by genes and the environment and gene-environment interaction. Her critical research on the cultural of science has received widespread attention. I know I show her plots all the time. She and her colleagues have demonstrated the continued problem of sexual harassment and assault in the field: sciences, astronomy, and planetary science. She was a member of the report that we're talking about today. Eric Riggs, we've done this, we've flipped this. He's not the next one over there. He's Associate Professor of Geoscience Education in the Department of Geology and Geophysics at Texas A&M. His research is on understanding how people learn, develop expertise through complex geologic settings through the lens of embodied cognition and culturally mediated cognition, including international and cross-cultural learning situations. He served as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Climate in the College of Geosciences, and he's also served as the chair of the American Geosciences Institute, who have also ad hoc committee on harassment in the geosciences that shepherded forward a 2018 adoption of the Federation-wide position statement against harassment in all forms of geoscience. Sue Webb is an award-winning educator and researcher in geophysics in the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Her research is focused on applying geophysical methods to investigate the Earth at multiple scales and times, from the Bushveld complex to investigating lightning in Lesotho. She's passionate about involving students in research. She served on the board of directors of AGU from 2014 to 2017 as the International Secretary, and directs the Africa Array of Geophysics program that brings participants from all over Africa and the US, structured to learn innovative ways of geophysics. Rhonda Davis is the head of, we're totally not in line, but they can wave when I say their name. Rhonda Davis is the head of the National Science Foundation's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. She has over 25 years of experience as a change agent in the federal government. She joined NSF in 2010, coming from the Department of Agriculture, where she served in several leadership positions in the civil rights effort. Her experience in establishing and managing non-discrimination and diversity programs enabled her to make significant contributions to the very important goal of NSF to excel as a federal agency with a diverse and engaging high-performance workforce. And the last member of our panel is Congressman Jackie Speer, who represents California's 14th Congressional District, which stretches from the southern portion of San Francisco through San Mateo County. She's been recognized as a champion of women's rights, privacy, community, and consumer safety, as an avowed opponent of government inefficiency and waste. In 2012, Newsweek listed her as one of the 150 fearless women. She serves on the House Armed Services as a ranking member of the Subcommittee on Military Personnel, on the House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence, and co-chair of the Armenian Caucus. She's recently served as the Democratic member of the committee that House Republicans established to attack women's health, an appointment she agreed to in order to defend women's health and hold the committee's leadership accountable. As you can see, we have a wonderful panel from the group that helped to write the report to the people who are thinking about how to implement it across all different sectors. So please help me welcome our panelists. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Before I get started, I just want to quickly thank Billy Williams and the AGU leadership for organizing this panel and for advancing the work to prevent sexual harassment. I have the challenging task to give you a brief overview of a 300-page report. This was a report that was initiated in early fall of 2016 and was authored by a 21-person committee that was led by Dr. Paula Johnson, president of Wellesley College, and Dr. Sheila Widnall, the institute professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I served as the study director for this report, and so that is to say that what I'm going to present to you today are the committee's views on consensus in the findings and recommendations, and not my own. The committee included established scientists, engineers, health professionals, and legal scholars, a former congresswoman, university department chairs, deans, and presidents, as well as representation from professional societies, and importantly, individuals who have done research on sexual harassment for their whole careers. As a result, the report rests on over 30 years of research on sexual harassment and presents the consensus of a diverse range of stakeholders. Before I get to the report findings and recommendations, I want to acknowledge the organizations that sponsored this work and enabled it to occur. The National Science Foundation was the lead sponsor of this work, and they were joined by a number of federal agencies and private foundations you see listed here. Now, to the findings. Beyond finding that sexual harassment is common in academic science, engineering, and medicine, one of the crucial contributions this report made was to clearly lay out the 3 types of sexual harassment and how they impact those who experience and witness it. To do so, the committee used social science research and legal scholarship to identify 3 types of sexual harassment and then to map them onto this image of the iceberg. In this image, the waterline denotes the public consciousness around the term sexual harassment. That is, what's above the waterline the public is aware of and thinks of when they hear the term sexual harassment, and what is below is not usually thought of. So at the top of the iceberg, most readily recognizable to the public, is the term sexual coercion. This refers to implicit or explicit attempts to make conditions of employment or education contingent upon sexual cooperation. This is the prototypical sleep with me or you're fired situation. It is often the first thing that comes to people's mind when they think about sexual harassment, but it is also the rarest form of sexual harassment. The second form is unwanted sexual attention. This refers to sexual advances that are unwelcome, unreciprocated, and unpleasant to the target. It includes unwanted touching, hugging, stroking, kissing, and relentless pressure for dates or sexual behavior despite discouragement. This form of sexual harassment can, and sometimes does, include sexual assault. In other words, the same behavior can sometimes be both a civil rights violation and a crime. And on this image of the iceberg, this type of behavior is both above the waterline and slightly below. All that's to say that most of the time, sexual harassment is a put-down and does not have the appearance of being a come-on as the other 2 forms do. The most common form of sexual harassment is gender harassment. This is verbal and visual conduct that conveys hostility, objectification, exclusion, or second-class status about members of one gender. This can play out as comments like, women aren't cut out to be scientists, or mothers don't belong in the field. It can also refer to degrading images and words in the ambient environment. The gender-harassing conduct in this image is submerged underwater because most people don't realize it is a form of sexual harassment. But as with icebergs, what's underwater is crucially important and can be rather dangerous. It might be tempting to assume a continuum of severity with these behaviors, that what is at the top of the iceberg is worse than what's at the bottom of the iceberg. But the committee reviewed the evidence and found that this assumption does not hold up to scientific scrutiny. What they found is that even when sexual harassment entails nothing but gender harassment, it takes a toll on victims. In fact, severe or pervasive gender harassment does the same professional and psychological damage as an isolated instance of sexual coercion. The committee found that these professional and psychological damages I just mentioned include, on the mental and physical side, depression, disordered eating, stress, anxiety, and even post-traumatic stress disorder, and physical complaints like headaches, exhaustion, and sleep disruption. While on the professional side, it derails women's work lives as they withdraw from their jobs in various ways, all in an effort to escape an abusive situation. The committee concluded that the cumulative effect of sexual harassment is significant damage to research integrity and a costly loss of talent in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. The committee made the recommendation that leaders in academic institutions and research and training sites pay increased attention to and enact policies that cover gender harassment as a means of addressing the most common form of sexual harassment and of preventing other types of sexually harassing behavior. So knowing what sexual harassment is and how harmful it can be, the question becomes, what can we do about it? Based on the research reviewed by the committee, they found that institutions can prevent and effectively address all forms of sexual harassment by making system-wide changes to the culture and climate. This is because the research shows that it is organizational characteristics that predict high rates of sexual harassment, not individual level factors. The two characteristics most associated with high rates of sexual harassment in environments are being male-dominated and having an organizational climate that communicates a tolerance of sexual harassment. While both characteristics are important, the committee found that it is the second of these two, the organizational climate that communicates tolerance of sexual harassment, that is by far the greatest predictor of sexual harassment. There are three characteristics that create such tolerant environments. The first, that there's a perceived risk to victims for reporting sexual harassment, that they will be retaliated against. Second, that there's a perception that one's complaints will not be taken seriously, that they will be dismissed, that formal investigations will not be launched. And third, that there is a perceived lack of sanctions against offenders. So it's based on these findings that the committee made a number of recommendations for how to address and fix the climate in academia. Today, given the time we have, I'm going to show you a short 2-minute video of the top 4 things academic institutions can do to start preventing sexual harassment.
As a country, we have woken up to the ways women's lives are impacted by sexual harassment. The time has come to focus on academic institutions, especially in male-dominated fields like science, engineering, and medicine. Together, we can do better by creating a climate that discourages all forms of sexual harassment, including sexual coercion, unwanted sexual attention, and gender harassment. Research shows that we must do more than attend occasional training sessions and review vague policies and procedures. Here is what we need to do. 1. Integrate values into the system. Policies and procedures must embody the institutional values of diversity, inclusion, and respect, especially for hiring, promotion, and tenure decision-making. 2. Change the power dynamics. With funding, research focus, and professional reputation wrapped up in a single advisor-trainee relationship, the potential for abuse is too high. Institutions need to diffuse these dependencies by encouraging advisor networks and provide independent funding so students and trainees have options. 3. Support targets of sexual harassment. Many women don't report sexual harassment because they fear it will hurt them in their careers, and it does. Institutions must do more to support targets by providing alternative ways to access support services, record information about an incident, and report an incident without fear of retaliation. 4. Improve transparency and accountability. While still respecting people's privacy, institutions need to make their communities aware of the consequences sexual harassers will face and demonstrate that the institution investigates incidents and holds people accountable. Now is the time for institutions to take action. We can prevent sexual harassment.
So the committee also made recommendations to professional societies that they should accelerate their efforts to be viewed as organizations that are helping to create culture change that can reduce and prevent the occurrence of sexual harassment.
Okay, good.
And there are a couple of examples that we included in the report, many of which AGU is already pursuing or implemented. But they include, very briefly, enacting and strengthening codes of conduct, investigating reports of sexual harassment, requiring members to acknowledge the codes of conduct, supporting and designing programs that prevent harassment and giving skills to intervene when harassment is occurring, and factoring in harassment-related professional misconduct into scientific award decisions. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Clancy, to Representative Jackie Spear for improvising on the fly. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to join you. The change of speakers has more to do with the fact that we have a vote about to be called, and I'm going to have to get back to the House. But I want to first of all thank each and every one of you for being here, and the AGU for recognizing the importance of having this be one of the topics that's discussed at the fall program. Let me start off by asking, how many of you have been sexually harassed? I sort of expected that. You're the very people that don't need to be here because you know what the problem is, and that those who should be here are probably elsewhere. But this is a first step in terms of dealing with this issue. In 2016, my office was alerted to a decades-old report regarding Dr. Timothy Slater, a professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona at the time. The report, which had been sealed until then, showed that the university had allowed Dr. Slater to terrorize staff and students. One incident involved giving an employee a vegetable-shaped vibrator at a holiday party. Another egregious episode included Dr. Slater forcing a grad student to go to a strip club to discuss her thesis. Despite an investigation and this stunning report, Dr. Slater was allowed to stay at the university until he found a new job and a new group of potential victims at the University of Wyoming. Wyoming knew of these allegations but hired him anyway because they knew he could bring in big federal dollars. I was disgusted and repelled by that particular report. And I truly believe that the federal government should not be funding anyone who engages in sexual harassment. And I can assure you that the American taxpayers have no interest in funding sexual harassments in science or any other field, because that is not what we are about as a nation. So one of the things I did, because that had been sealed, I have the ability on the House floor to, under the debate clause, to talk about things and not be sued. So I then proceeded to read the entire report on the House floor. That's how disgusting it was. That's how strongly I felt that this had to be changed. So I started doing more research and looking at other professors. Jeff Marcy was one of them at UC Berkeley, who had a remarkable career. But then he engaged in sexual harassment. 4 of his students came forward and talked about him massaging them, groping them, kissing them, all of which was substantiated. But then the professor was allowed to stay with the understanding that he would follow an improvement plan. Well, then BuzzFeed did a story and outed him and his conduct, and some 2,500 students at the university petitioned that he be removed, and many of his colleagues did as well. One of the young women who was a student of his participated in a hearing and at a forum that I held Her name is Sarah Ballard. She's probably known to a number of you. Just an incredibly talented young scientist, and has been identified as a planet hunter. He said to her, "You have such promise to go so very far." And then he slowly continued to make requests of her. And eventually, she ran out of a car that she was seated in with him when he was massaging her. And she went through a whole period where she wanted to quit. Here's a talented scientist, part of a new generation of leaders, who almost lost her fervor to continue in her work because of one professor who crossed the line. She actually thought that maybe she was to blame. And then she thought, well, maybe I'm not as good as he says I am, because he was really only trying to seduce me sexually. And it doesn't stop there. We heard just a few weeks ago that 7 women at Dartmouth College had filed suit over sexual assaults, harassment, and discrimination that they had endured from 3 professors. This conduct has gone on for over 15 years at Dartmouth. And until the suits were filed, no one took it seriously. But now they're taking it seriously because it's a $70 million suit that's been filed. So, what are we doing? Well, I introduced legislation called the Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act back in 2016. And then last year we had the Me Too movement. So originally I introduced the bill to seek transparency by requiring universities to inform federal agencies about the substantiated findings of sexual abuse, harassment, or discrimination. My bill simply asked agencies to take these findings into account when awarding future competitive research grants. It also required a report to Congress on how many awards were still made despite substantiated findings. That was 2 years ago, before Me Too, and the bill didn't even receive a hearing in Congress. That is about to change in the new House of Representatives come January 4th. And it was also before the National Academy of Sciences published a report that found that 50% of women faculty and staff reported having been harassed, and that 20 to 50% of female students experienced sexual harassing behavior perpetrated by faculty and staff. We are not going to allow our institutions of higher learning to be breeding grounds for sexual predators. This has to stop. So, I applaud the National Science Foundation for taking steps to basically say, if you sexually harass, you're going to lose your funding. And I want to see NIH do the same, and I'm now crafting new legislation that's going to create even greater teeth into this program. Let me just say that we are in a new world order. And as more and more women are in the sciences and taking very active and leadership roles, as more and more women are joining the military and taking active and leadership roles. As we look across every occupation in this country, it is changing. And it's time for the culture in each of these various areas to change as well. So I look forward to working with you. I look forward to seeing your leadership skills soar. And to every one of you who has been sexually harassed, I say, I believe you, and your institutions of higher learning should believe you as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Should I wait for my slides? Okay, great. All right, so my name's Kate Clancy. I just wanted to, in some ways I'm going to be following up and adding some evidence-based heft to the really important points that Fraser has already brought up. I first wanted to start with, I had a recent conversation with a geology grad student who said to me she was really frustrated with some of her colleagues because a lot of them said, you know, since there weren't a lot of geologists in my sample for the survey of academic field experiences, most geologists don't really think that research applies to them, and sexual harassment probably isn't that really that big of a deal in geology. And I just want to say that not being hugely represented in one study doesn't exempt you from 30 years of evidence to show the ways in which harassment affects women in the American workplace. So again, just to kind of undergird some of the points that Fraser has made, sexual harassment is rarely sexual. It's in fact mostly sexist. As Lilia Cortina, one of the other members of our committee, has said, it's more about contempt than conquest. It's more about assholery than lechery. And this is really not belied by what we see in terms of media representations. So we've got come-ons, the sexual forms of harassment, and put-downs, the sexist forms. And we can come up with a lot of examples of come-ons. We've got Brian Richmond from anthropology. We've got Jeff Marcy. We've got Christian Ott. We've got Inder Verma. These are all sexual forms of harassment that we've all become fairly familiar with because there have been a number of articles about them. But, and because you're geologists, you should know about this one, we do have at least one example in the media of put-downs or more gendered forms of harassment in the form of Boston University geologist David Marchant, who, as you know, threw rocks at women when they tried to urinate, pushed them down a mountain, tried to get them to sleep with his brother, called them bitch, cunt, and slut. And if these words bother you, imagine how much they bother a trainee when they're hearing these things in Antarctica, when they are not with anybody else they know. Now, like I said, this evidence, we are looking at, and the evidence base for our report was 30 years of the science of sexual harassment. And what we found across many, many data sets for 30 years, and unfortunately this number hasn't really changed, is about 75% of women experience sexual harassment in the workplace. And that number doesn't vary that much, and it has not improved that much. Of that 75% or so, the vast majority of it involved those put-downs. And it's really important to understand that that means that the representation of how we think about sexual harassment really does not match the reality. And then that means the way that we think about how to solve it doesn't match that reality. So if we are to think about that iceberg, again, one more time, we have unwanted sexual advances and sexual coercion overrepresented in the media, overrepresented in our training, overrepresented in reporting structures, and in the kinds of statements people make against sexual harassment. Whereas what actually is supporting that and allowing it to happen are the kinds of gender harassment that actually have been shown to have more profound professional consequences than sexual forms of sexual harassment. The other thing that's unfortunate about the way sexual harassment happens, especially in the field sciences, is that it actually is a different experience quantitatively and qualitatively for women. So women experience, in general, across pretty much every American workplace that's ever been studied, women experience quantitatively more sexual harassment. But in the field sciences, what we found so far is that women also experience a qualitatively different form of harassment, where the folks who are superior to them in the hierarchy are more likely to be their perpetrators. Where for men, it's the most common perpetrator are their peers. When you have vertical harassment, you again have more severe outcomes. You actually have, you have more work withdrawal, higher turnover intentions, more intent to leave, and it is just a harder place for you. And when you think about the positional hierarchy of academia and how strongly we hold to this idea that your advisor is the person who's going to march you through and help you make your way in your field, having someone superior to you who's your perpetrator is going to severely limit your ability to succeed in academia. So these personal and professional consequences, again, I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of evidence. This is looking at not just harassment, but incivility, which has been shown to undergird and be predictive of sexual harassment in the workplace. Incivilities are sort of rude behaviors of ambiguous intent. So someone isn't saying to you, I'm doing this to you because you're a woman or because you're a person of color. So it's more ambiguous why it's happening, but a lot of folks who study incivilities have said that these are the ways in which racism and sexism go underground in the modern American workplace. And you can see that the effects of incivility in terms of job-related outcomes are actually incredibly profound, even though these seem like very small slights. And then you have additional worsening of outcomes when you add in gender harassment and sexualized forms of harassment. To draw from some of my own data on the field sciences, I want to add 2 quick quotes. And this is, to me, one of the more heartbreaking parts of my research, is I've, at this point, interviewed dozens of folks in the sciences around their lived experiences, and a lot of them really try to change who they are. They do various forms of code switching in order to survive in the sciences. So here's one quote from a field scientist where she says, "I like being in the dirt. I like being in the sun. I love discovery. I love all those things. I may be able to drink and swear with the rest of them, but in the end, I still have a certain vulnerability that I have to take into account." She never gets to bring her whole self to her job and never gets to just delight in how wonderful it is to be doing field work, because she's always having to also be aware of how she's perceived and how she can protect herself. And the most unfortunate part of it of all is that even when she does these things, she's still vulnerable to harassment, because as I'm sure you know, it doesn't actually matter all that much, if at all, what a victim does. What matters is what a perpetrator chooses to do with their power. Another example, this is one I'm having. Well, I've had to redefine who I am. I want to say because of it, so this is because of a harassment experience. I don't want to say I can't do the things that I used to do, but I have to change the way that I do the things I used to do. I haven't really gotten good at doing that yet. It has certainly affected my career. So at the end of the day, the way to fix sexual harassment comes in many ways from the science of sexual harassment and these 30 years of evidence. And the only way to fix it is to switch our perception about the types of sexual harassment that's actually the most prevalent and use that to motivate some changes in how we actually create different types of trainings and solutions for this. So in the field sciences, one of the things that came up quite a bit are folks who talked about the fact that the men in their field site really wanted to be Indiana Jones. And they were all like, oh yeah, the dude bros in my field site, they were all like Indiana Jones. They were constantly competing with each other. It was incredibly hard. And what I think you need to ask yourself when you think about the culture of field work and the culture of being a geologist, an archaeologist, an ecologist, is, are you elevating the history of men and their adventuring over the work of women? Is your field dominated by masculine portrayals of field work? Is your day-to-day work more of a masculinity contest than an inclusive, cooperative environment? These are the kinds of questions you have to ask if you actually want to produce change, and then you have to think of concrete ways to produce that change. And I'll give you just one quick example from my university, the University of Illinois. Just a few years ago, like most campuses, there are basically no images of people of color, no images of women that are, that are sort of including us in these spaces, until Quinn. Quinn is the quintessential engineer. The University of Illinois is a major engineering campus. And when this statue, which is a very obviously gendered female statue, was released, it was an incredibly big deal. There were social media postings. Tons of women engineering students were getting selfies taken with Quinn because they all felt like this was the first time they had ever seen themselves at their university really being included. And I want you to, again, think about what does that mean in terms of what it means to be a geologist and whether people feel included in your own discipline. Finally, in terms of producing real change, we need to move from this concept of making victims responsible for fixing our workplace and one by one going after each of the bad apples, and understand that the issue is the whole barrel is actually rotten. It's the culture that we are living in and perpetuating and promoting, and the incentive structures that we've been allowed to persist within the sciences. So we need to eliminate male domination in terms of the overall numbers within the sciences, and specifically those who are in leadership positions. We need to reduce tolerance for harassment. You can't see harassment happen and then say, oh, that person can handle it, it's probably fine. You have to start thinking about, how can I intervene? You need to develop trauma-informed communication policies. When you send mass mails to your organizations, to your universities, are you thinking about the fact that actually the majority of the people reading your work are themselves victims of some kind of trauma? And are you using that to motivate the kinds of language you use when you talk to them? And finally, use evidence-based training. Use bystander intervention, perspective taking, because there is ample evidence to suggest that the vast majority of the online knowledge-based training, which focuses too much on sexual and not sexist harassment, doesn't help and actually might make things worse. Thanks. Here you go.
Take care.
Oh, sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, my name is Eric Riggs. I'm a geologist. I'm a geoscience educator. I've been a field instructor. I've been a field camp leader and also a field camp instructor. I'm a geoscience education researcher that focuses on cultural, social, and cognitive factors in learning expertise, diversity, and field choice in geology. And so we use a lot of tools of social science as well as tools of educational psychology and sociology as applicable. In addition to the professional roles I've been able to serve in and administrative roles I've been able to contribute to my university, I've also been part of teams looking at issues related to field choice in geology and also harassment in the field. So I'm going to give you a little bit of data today that I think addresses some of Kate's comments that geology doesn't have its hands clean. I think geophysics would probably be in the same boat. We're trying to understand the persistent underrepresentation of women in geology. We focused specifically on geology in our study. If you look at some of the national numbers in the US, you see women at all levels, academic levels, so bachelor's, master's, PhD, approach about 40% and largely stay there. So what's going on? Why is there this persistent underrepresentation? And it certainly got us thinking, well, maybe there are some cultural factors engaged here. So who's we? I have a team that I've been working with on this. There's no way I could do this myself. Julie Sexton, Harmony Newman, Kevin Pugh, Cassie Bergstrom, Michael Phillips, all from the University of Northern Colorado, are colleagues of mine doing this work, and now Crystal Heinerman at Lamar University. So our team is a bunch of social psychologists, geoscience educators, gender experts in sociology, and we're approaching this issue at this point from the undergraduate experience. I know the graduate experience and professional experience is relevant, but we're trying to understand that first step into geology as a field choice. Fortunately, we have some tools to do this. We are using the lens of social cognitive career theory, advanced by Lent and some of his colleagues, a number of others. This involves looking at personal factors, which would include self-efficacy, interest, and experiences, in addition to contextual factors like institutional and programmatic factors, the presence of role models, and instructional environments. So we had a study that was based at 6 research universities, all public, all large, all with all the array of geoscience options available to students, and all which had fairly substantial production of geology majors over the last decade. We collected survey from over 2,000 undergraduate students, from introductory classes all the way through graduates and into field camp. And we also conducted long format interviews and focus groups with 80 students and 36 faculty spread evenly across all of our partnering institutions. The quantitative data, or survey data, showed that the sites that were good at developing and retaining and graduating women above the national average, sometimes well above the national average, all were successful at lowering institutional barriers for women, and all students, in fact. Men as well benefited from this. The connections to instructors were also very robust. This came out as a very strong element in our quantitative data. Interestingly, for women, this was more important. We did some structural equation modeling and found that, in fact, this loaded more heavily for women. But interestingly, for majors, women who are majors, you see instructional connection drop off as a function of time in the majors. So there's something in our culture that is preventing that connection for some women. Also, sites that were very good at graduating large numbers of women were very good at bringing transformative experiences to students and making sure that those were very high-quality experiences. These are experiences that are driven by learning that lead people to see and experience the world in meaningful new ways. And this is what also led us to fieldwork, and I'll get there in a second. The qualitative portion of our study has found that, sorry folks, 50% of participants at all our sites reported encountering or being aware of active sexism or those who hold sexist beliefs. So to Kate's comments, this is our problem just the same as it's true across STEM. The number of hands that went up earlier makes that quite clear. We've also been able to document different types of gendered harassment going on out there. These are hostile sexism, subtle benevolent sexism, and also subtle stereotype sexism. So hostile sexism is what you might think it is. It's just direct, sort of overt statements about, that express sexist thoughts. Subtle benevolent sexism is much more insidious, and it's difficult to disentangle from culture regionally, where you'd be, oh, it's okay, let me carry that for you, or something like this, and this comes out in field environments in particular. And then stereotype sexism is, oh, well, women don't like to do this type of thing, or men prefer to do this, implying that interest for somebody, making decisions for someone already, and then that determines how they get treated. So hostile sexism, sadly, was the most frequently reported, but all of these are components of gender harassment and all surround that iceberg figure that you've seen and are part of the culture and part of the climate. These findings suggest that overt hostile sexism and subtle forms of sexism are common in the geosciences, and so we need to own this and take control of it. Sexism is very relevant for the many factors in social cognitive career theory. It influences the context that people are in. It influences the self-efficacy and personal goals, sense of empowerment that female students and male students have, both. Looking at field environments, this came strongly out of our qualitative data. It turns out that the field environment showed a disproportionately large influence of field experiences in all of these contextual and personal factors at all of the universities. It was more prevalent at the low sites where we saw problems with this, but it was present at all. All types of sexism were more prevalent in field environments or had a greater impact on students while they were in the field, women and men both in that setting. Most common reports were, like Indiana Jones, the existence of a macho culture, sort of this competition of hypermasculinity in the field, stereotypes about women's field ability or interest in being in the field, and differences in treatment of women in the field, typically by peers, not necessarily by supervisors, but there are instances of that too. And so this again echoes some of the findings of the National Academies report. So we are digging into this more. This work is not done. We are looking at field as a transformative experience. Anybody who's been in geology and has done field work sees that this is indeed formative. We don't understand all the ways field environments are transformative, but the evidence we do have suggests that the learning environment has a major impact on persistence in geology and career trajectory. Research in other content areas also shows that if transformative experiences go well, it tends to be a very positive experience and tends to drive people toward careers. Conversely, if it goes badly, it has a very outsized negative influence on people's persistence in a field. So the next phase of our research is to understand field camp climate and culture. Influence through the structure of the environment, the structure of curriculum, environment, everything that goes around being in the field in relatively controlled settings, because we need to approach this systematically and scientifically. Our goal is to understand how we can manage this critical learning environment for the benefit of all students and remove barriers related to harassment along any personal dimensions of diversity. Thanks.
Yeah, move to the middle.
Hi, my name is Susan Webb, and I'm from University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. I run a field program that is international, and it brings in people from the United States, from all over Africa, and especially the core is from South Africa. And in this field school, I'm completely in charge. I run it, and so I am very much on top of if there's problems sending people home and things like that. But what I've learned over the years is that we have to be very careful about opportunity versus safety. There are many international field programs that are available to students. Often because of limited budgets, we may send one person overseas to those. So a student from the United States may show up on a field program somewhere in Africa with very little preparation. And so it is important for people to realize, I'm going to get a little bit more into the weeds, perhaps, and some very practical comments. The framework that has been made has been really incredibly helpful. One of the problems is in the field, behavior often changes. There can still be a culture of what happens in the field stays in the field, and this can really be pervasive. The awareness of the Me Too movement and the changes that have happened in the United States is often not reflected internationally. And so we must be very, very careful about that, of giving people opportunity, but also an awareness of safety. I recently actually had to pull a student from a field project because of harassment issues. And I was a little bit surprised in myself that the student didn't realize she had permission to actually leave. And so we need to empower our students if they are in a situation where they are questioning if they're safe, they must feel they are empowered to leave, and we must support those decisions. Another comment about just the opportunity versus safety is to develop at least more than one person going, if possible. I'd also like to comment on written guidelines. These are great if they're effective, but frequently they are simply put out there, or there's a small test taken to fill in a blank. But that can lead to resentment, and it also doesn't lead to real engagement. So one of the effective ways we've developed is to actually have groups in the field themselves develop behavior guidelines. And this becomes the basis for which people interact. And this has proved to be a way of getting people to interact with the issues, but also to change their own behavior. Finally, harassment isn't just about sexual harassment. It's also about diversity. And it becomes an issue. For example, one year on my field school, we had 17 different countries represented. I can tell you there were conflicts every single day. And we simply sat down and learned to work through conflicts, both of a sexual nature and of cultural nature, and really learned to come to grips with how to deal with things. And I think this kind of a robust addressing things directly in the field is important, but we must be very careful about how we structure this. It is unfair to put junior students or teaching assistants in charge of this sort of thing. And sometimes we see senior people reluctant to tackle this sort of a behavior in an international environment because the access to the site may actually depend on a local person that is part of the problem. And so these structural problems are something we have to be very careful about how we address, and that we don't put people in circumstances where they cannot deal with it. So one effective way we found is to do daily debriefings, where we debrief on the science, what science was done that day. We debrief on the safety issues, what was unsafe, what happened, what accidents might have happened, but also on the culture debriefing, so that every day you start talking about it and bringing up, well, this was not appropriate and this was offensive. And you can just start bringing it into the conversation so that it becomes part of learning how to deal with it. And I'm not saying we have to learn how to deal with it is the final solution, but it is the pragmatic solution that's happening right now. And we need to change the culture by starting to deal with these things instead of just ignoring it. The number of times I've had students come back and say, my American colleagues, that nothing was dealt with, nothing was done, we don't know how to deal with it. It's got to start being addressed in the field and working it through. And we need more research internationally. I think a lot of the research that was done is very US-based. And I would like to say we need to start getting on top of some of the international work that is being done and really digging down into that and seeing how we can make effective structural changes. So I'll leave it there with those 4 points, and thank you very much.
I run to, excuse me, make up time. Greetings, I'm Rhonda Davis. I was trying to see, can I do it in about 4 minutes, but now I'm going to see, can I cut it down into a minute, because I think it's very important for, if we have time for Q&A, we can. I could talk about how great our director is, who is that this is on her vision, and all the extra work she's done to make sure that all of it cascades down, which is all true. I can talk about how everybody's getting together for task forces to discuss this topic and make a difference. But I'll skip all that because you can go to our website, nsf.gov/harassment, and find all that information. So I'd like to just jump to what we did do. We put out a term and condition. It became effective October 22nd of this year. And at a minimum, this is what NSF is considering: the safety and security of the personnel supported by the NSF award, the overall impact to the NSF-funded activity, the continued advancement of taxpayer-funded investments in science and scientists, and whether the awardee has taken appropriate actions to ensure the continuity of science and that continued progress under the funded project can be made. So we've asked awardees to make us aware if there is a PI or co-PI on an NSF-funded grant that some form of administrative action has been taken as a result of harassment. We expanded because of the National Academy of Science report from just sexual harassment to forms of harassment that's any awardee's code of conduct. We also want to know when a final finding has taken place against a co-PI or PI that we're funded. You also can find all that information on NSF's harassment portal. So I'm just going to jump to a very quick conclusion to help get us on track, is that we at NSF, we believe that with the support of organizations just like you, with Congress, with the research community, that we all can work together to eradicate sexual harassment and all forms of harassment from the scientific research community. Thank you.
We're really running short here because we've been having so much time. Fun learning, not fun learning, really compelling learning. And thank you guys so much. I thought I'd actually ask just 2 quick questions for you to respond to. One is, what do you think about the issue that some people think we've gone too far with the Me Too movement and there's sort of a backlash? What is your advice for dealing with that and dealing with people who say this has gone too far? What do you think?
Well, what's gone too far?
The whole addressing the issue. Well, here, what?
But I feel like that's the first question to ask: is what exactly has gone too far? Who exactly has been harmed by this move to try to create equity, right? And I think it's worth also noticing, for me at least, the implicit question in that is often around, say, false accusations. And a man is actually more likely to himself be sexually harassed than he is to be falsely accused of sexual harassment. I mean, that's what the data show. And so I would think it's more important for us to be thinking about how can we all be understanding that this is a common problem for us all to be addressing, rather than worrying that this is about pitting different groups against each other. Because again, we're all actually quite likely to be harmed, and we're all likely to cause harm. If we can back off from that defensiveness and recognize that, again, this sort of whole barrel approach, this acknowledgement that restorative capacity building really has to be part of how we solve this, as opposed to punitive reporting measures, then I think that that's going to get us in the right direction.
Other sort of thoughts on this?
Sure, I agree with all that, and I think we can take a different tack also and look at it from the point of view of our workforce. We need everybody in the geosciences still. We are still facing some workforce shortages down the road, and the data are also clear that if you improve the environments for women, you also improve the environments for everybody. The entire educational experience is better across all dimensions of diversity, and so it absolutely makes sense to clean house in this regard. I think it's just civility. It just removes extra barriers that have we've tolerated as part of the status quo.
Yes, and I think internationally, we have gotten nowhere near, is this gone too far? We're still at the very beginning stages in many of the programs, and many, some of the companies we work with don't even have policies in writing. So it is something to be very aware of as you move into an international environment. What are the policies of the place you're working with, and how do you agree with that, and who's actually in charge? Whose rules do your students fall under when they go overseas?
Okay. Since all these people came here today to listen to your sage insights, if they each should think about one thing they can do, when they walk out of here, what would do you guys have one thing? You'd say go to the NSF website to learn about.
That's right. Go there first.
I know.
First.
But how about other sort of one things that people can walk away here with advice on how to address this issue?
That's a hard one to boil 300 pages down into
Oh, it
one
is.
thing.
Well, maybe it's read the 300-page document. Maybe that's what
it is
you're
available for free on our website. I think the one thing I would say is this awareness of the gender harassment piece, that it's this pervasive climate that conveys a tolerance. When you see one comment mentioned in a public setting and nobody says a thing, that immediately triggers a tolerance of sexual harassment. And so we need to start paying attention to that piece of this.
That's a great one. Any other?
I'm going to cheat and say two, but the first
Okay,
one's
you can
super
just
fast.
pretend it's one. You just
I'm
pretend
going
it's
to pretend it's one, because the first thing is actually, and I was just saying this to Robin before we came out, is that I've really noticed that people have been transformed by the reading of the entire report. And it's great to read the executive summary, but take the time to read the report. That is what will help you move forward on this. And related to that, what I would say is, walking out of here, if you can think of every decision that you make as a scientist where you are leading with your values instead of leading with your fear, you're going to start making better decisions about how to create a better climate for science.
I love your leading with science instead of with fear, but I will say it's a hard read, the report.
I don't think it's hard.
I would say that.
Oh, I meant hard in that it's gut-wrenching. Sorry, I didn't mean hard scientifically. I meant hard in the middle of your heart.
Yeah.
Well, and to follow that point, I think it is hard, but I think if we're going to be responsible at what we do, everybody needs to take some ownership of
Right.
this. And make it personal, make it local. Look at what you can do in your own environment.
Okay.
Say something if something doesn't seem right, and talk about it. These things only progress if there are open and transparent and frank, difficult, very hard discussions.
And that's a perfect segue into what I'm saying is I would say just actively involve more women. I mean, I remember this year on my field school, I had, there were 6 women that were selected to be sponsored and come through for the field school. And one of the first to arrive said, I thought I was going to be the only woman. And I thought, wow, that's really quite frightening. But with a big group of women, it makes a big difference. And so just supporting it and actively being involved and actively caring about how the environment feels, it's very important.
And I would say the individuals in here should go out and share this information with as many people as possible. Their colleagues, their friends who are having experiences, and they don't know these resources are here. They may not even know about the National Academies of Sciences report or what we're doing. So share, share, share often and frequently.
Well, thank you very much. And Luke, should we give everybody a... And I think we can all think about stepping out and leading with the science and being able to have the science backing up as we try and change our science. So thank you very much.